Hello, listeners, and welcome to part 2 of this mini-series on the Odyssey study group Revisited. For more information on Esther Friedman and her work, you can follow the links in the episode description. But for now, here is Esther. The Gentle Souls Revolution does an excellent job of helping the reader understand why certain things can happen and you don't make the decision to leave right away. And that's so important for anyone listening, and myself included, that hasn't had a personal cultic experience, to be able to fathom the idea of why didn't you just leave?
Yeah.
The same as like, how could you join a cult? All of those really kind of naive statements that are thrown about and are quite damaging
Mhm.
and are totally misrepresentative of what actually happens.
Right.
As you said, it's con artistry. You're being duped. You're being told that what you're being sold is one thing, and it turns out to be something completely different.
Opposite.
What your book does so well is really allow the reader to understand how the level of dependency is ramped up. And I have not come across this in any other book that I've read, and I've been through a lot of memoirs over the last few years. In terms of your first interaction with Lisa up to where you are around the time you decide to leave, you're a completely different person at that point. And there's something in the book that says something along the lines of, I'm not even sure how to wipe my own ass at this point. And of course, in keeping with your humor all the way through as well. But we'd gone through that journey with you, so I felt that was authentic, that's truly how you felt in that moment. You cannot make any decisions for yourself. So I wondered if you could just talk the listeners through how you were able to put that on paper. I don't know that I'd be able to do that with writing.
Well, Casey, I love this question. The truth is, I couldn't not write it. That is simply how I'm wired. And I told you last night I was hanging out with some fellow disgruntled ex-students, as we're known, um, and talking about that very thing with this person. That was my recovery. I had to write it. When I mean, it started out as journaling and then it turned into a blog and then the blog turned into the book, right? So the more I could process through writing, also songwriting, any other, I mean, even some drawing, like I'm a, I'm, I'm a creative person. It helps me survive. And that's another thing I kind of realized about me in childhood because, I grew up in the 70s. There wasn't a lot of kind of variation in learning styles, at that point. But I was always doodling and drawing on my notebooks and then getting in trouble, right? And I realized like that was me managing like attention deficit disorder and anxiety, Um, so my recovery was writing. My recovery was doing whatever creative thing wanted to express itself so that I could get some distance from this crazy, fucking bizarre, surreal thing and walk away from it and look at it from a distance and then realize like, oh, these are reasons why I was vulnerable, lack of confidence, looking for guidance, seeking it from outside sources. Here's the way this particular group took advantage of it. Oh, here's a lost soul. We have just the thing for you, and this is why it worked. And part of why it worked was because of my own personal struggle. A lot of why this works is because some people know how to take advantage of human nature. For example, most people don't walk around suspicious of everyone they meet, right? Most people extend the benefit of the doubt because most people are not trying to dupe you. So I just feel like some people are wired to go like, here's an opening. And you see the same fucking dynamic play out in I mean, all of these groups, when you strip away the bells and whistles, they operate the same way. So it is really fascinating.
After you left school, and decided that you weren't going to go back, did anybody like come after you and attempt to get you back in, or were you kind of threatened not to talk? Because it's a hidden school, so one of the biggest worries of members that do actually say, "Oh my goodness, I can't do this anymore," which of
Hmm.
course by design is not going to be that many people. Uh, what happened? Were you just totally separated, or was there a period of sort of backwards and forwards?
There were some attempts to call me, and at the time, I mean, now, now I think if I got a call from one of the teachers now, I would probably take it so I could laugh. But for me, that was scary at the time.
Yeah.
Um, no one blatantly came after me or threatened me. There was in 2014 a very convoluted and stupid attempt to draw me into some legal, wranglings. I got extremely lucky because I happened to talk to a friend of mine who's a lawyer, and he connected me with this enormous firm, and I got pro bono. um, this doesn't happen. I got pro bono counseling from a global firm, and they just like squashed this completely ridiculous. I mean, it would be another 3 hours for me to explain how convoluted and stupid this attempted, subpoena was. So it was kind of in the background, insidious. Um, Sometimes I feel like I still get these weird messages that are, um, I think attempts to like get in there and find out what I'm doing. I had one person who befriended me, so to speak, online, and then was like, "I'd like to read your manuscript," and I was like, "You're not going to read my manuscript." So it's been kind of, and this is very like the nature of the Boston group, which I like to call the poor cousin, was it was more insidious, more covert, whereas I think New York, which is corporate headquarters, there was more blatant kind of, beat you over the head abusiveness, at least verbally. Um, so, it was so tepid. There was kind of tepid, insidious threats that I have to be honest, in the beginning, I think I was pretty naive. Like I was like, they're not going to come after me. And in a way, I was right. Like Boston likes to fly under the radar. It didn't occur to me that they could and they would. You know. So I think I've been extremely lucky in that way. Um, Part of it is that it's the nature of the group. Like if they're so secret, they don't really want to be in public documents like court cases. But New York does not seem to worry about that as much as Boston. So in another way, like I'm lucky if I was gonna do this that it was in Boston because I don't, maybe I'm stupid, but I don't feel that threatened by it.
It's a scary tactic to be served with legal papers, especially if you're not in a position to firstly understand really all of the legal jargon and terminology and even the nature of the papers that you've been served, but
Yeah.
also of course the financial position. Sharon Gans was, well, I suppose Alex before he was like, kicked out by his own spouse. Um,
Yeah.
Sharon Gans had a very particular type of person that she favored in the group. So school had a lot of lawyers, Spencer Schneider, a lawyer,
Hmm.
and various different people from middle to higher class occupations who would be able to connect or advise or pay for
Yeah.
very strong legal representation for schools. So, of course, when they come to you with legal papers, that fair gaming tactic is very scary.
Hmm.
And although you can't call their bluff and say, okay, then let's go to court, where they'd probably go, oh, no, actually, we don't want to. But then they just send representatives and people that aren't directly linked to schools. So it's tough. And I think that that tactic works most of the time. I think 90% of the time,
Yeah.
people are going to think, I can't do anything about this, so I'll never be able to tell my story.
Yeah, which is terrible because there's so many ways in which that re-traumatizes someone who's already traumatized. I mean, even my experience, which was really relatively tame compared to other people I've spoken to who have been threatened legally, you know, had me terrified. You know, I was like, financial ruin, this is my fault, I shouldn't have spoken out. These people really do have the power that I was afraid they had. You know, you go right back into that cult mindset. The court system becomes weaponized. It's terrible. You know, I really, this is obviously a topic I feel so passionately about. And I hope at some point there are some remedies for this misuse of the justice system, and you turn it into bullying and badgering and abusing people who have already been bullied and badgered and abused. It's terrible.
In your writing, there is a lot of references to various different educational pieces around cults and coercive control, which I thought was, again, quite different from a lot of the various memoirs I've read, and really helpful. It's like a reading list for
Yeah.
books to go and educate yourself inside a memoir about somebody's personal experiences in a cult. What was your cult education like after you left and after you began your healing journey of writing and then maybe thought, I'm going to put this into a book? What does that look like?
When I started stepping back from this group, and I mean, you know this because we've talked about this, but like there was literally, I took a road trip with my husband the week after I left the group, and the farther away we got from Massachusetts, we were going to South Carolina, the more I saw, and the more I started, these puzzle pieces started emerging, and the more manipulation and coercion I saw. So, um, by the time I got back, I think, you know, it's a weird thing to look back on because on the one hand, I was putting things together. On the other hand, there was still a little bit of starry eyed believer in me that was keeping the secret, right? And, but, you know, we got home and I was like, I feel crazy because I'm walking around like I'm normal and I have these scenes, like movie scenes, you know, running through my mind and I can't talk about it with anyone, right? So first I went to the internet and I found these, you know, evil websites by the disgruntled ex-students. The one that was really, really integral to my recovery was Esoteric Freedom, which was taken down by cult litigation. But everyone was going to this website and blog and writing about their stories. And I was like, holy shit, there are all these people writing about this. So I obsessively read, you know, the posts over and over again and everyone's comments and the responses to comments. That, you know, sent me to Steve Hassan's Freedom of Mind. Then Robert J. Lifton, I just read it. I mean, my book is falling apart. I can't even find it right now. But Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. I think that it's shredded now. I read it so many times. Margaret Singer's Cults in Our Midst. You know, I just started devouring as much material as I could. And the reason it was so fascinating to me is because I kept going, oh my God, school checks every fucking box. Everyone, you know, mystical manipulation. Yup. um, the confession. Yup. You know, all of it. Just I couldn't believe how, and then, in 2014, I also went to my first International Cultic Studies Association conference where I met former members from other groups. And I was like, we are all telling the same story here. All of these groups operate under these guidelines, you know? So it's so fascinating to me that there's a template for coerciveness and abusiveness. Um, and I still still devouring as much as I can. Like, I mean, lately it's been Dr. Ramani. Are you familiar with Dr. Ramani?
No, I don't think so.
She's a YouTube, well, she's a psychologist who's an expert on narcissism, but she has a YouTube channel that's got like millions and millions of people who are like, "Thank you so much for writing. Now I understand what was going on." You're like, "There's a problem here," you know. So
Makes me hope that this kind of work will allow people to bring some of the education into schools so that children can learn to recognize what this looks like, whether it's in a family home, whether it's in school itself, whether
mhm.
it's in your first job. I was treated horrifically in my first job, and I just thought, well, everyone's told me my whole life, don't grow up too quickly because work's horrible, and here I am, and they were right. Like, no, I think back now and I think, oh my goodness, that is not legal, I don't think.
Yeah,
So that is hopeful. The spotlight on cults and coercive control in the media, in documentaries, in newspapers, even in the legal systems right now. There's talk of bringing in certain measures around coercion.
hmm
It's so important, and it couldn't happen sooner. And this, your story of picking up these books and understanding what happened to you is testament to those things. Did you always know, once you'd decided you were going to write a complete book, did you always know that you would include
yeah,
parts of the cult education that you'd
yes.
learned at that point?
Yeah, I love that you asked this because most of the book is formatted so that I tell a vignette, and then there's a section on the analysis and the research and, interviews with other cult members. And then there's a section on here's a template for recovery. Take this, customize it for yourself. I hope it helps you, kind of a thing. Because I'm a therapist, so of course that's going to be my focus. But I think that including the research and the interviews with other members was really important to me because I wanted to really drive home, like, not only are all these groups alike, and if you talk to former members, you're going to get a different, a variation on the same themes, but there's research that points all of this out. Lifton, I think, was doing his interviews with prisoners or ex-prisoners from re-education camps in communist China in, like, I don't know, the early 70s. Now, his book is not easy to read, but the information's out there, and it's been out there for several decades. And I think what you're saying about education is so important because, listen, we don't learn how to spot con artists. They know how to spot us,
Yeah.
but we don't learn, like, if somebody does this, what's this thing, that I like to call consistently inconsistent, like, I'm gonna be there at 2, and you're waiting for your new boyfriend or girlfriend at 2, and you're like, it's 2:45, and then you get a phone call, I'm on my way. You gotta kind of start going, something isn't right here. That's just one example of consistently inconsistent. But you get the idea.
How long did your publication take to finish? How long were you working on it all together, do you think?
Oh, well, I started really writing it in 2016, and I was taking content from the blog, so that, part of it was kind of written, but and I just published in February, so how many years does that? Do the math, too long. um, but I think, in part that was because I was really determined to include research. I didn't want it to be simply a story about my experience. I have nothing wrong with memoirs. I think they're really important. Um, Spencer's memoir is really beautiful, and a very poignant example of how this shit works. And we're talking about like a really savvy New York lawyer. Um, and, you know, I think that most of the memoirs I've read are really poignant, but I wanted there to be this, like, yes, I've had this experience, and here are the things you need to look out for. Here are the red
Yeah.
flags that I wish I had known about. And here's the way you recover. Really wanted all those things in there.
Were you aware of Spencer and his story when you decided this was going to become a completed book? Did things keep happening where you were like, well, now I have to include this part and this part?
um, I, Spencer and I have been aware of each other, probably, I'm going to guess he put up a blog at some point, and I can't remember exactly when that was, maybe 2014, something like that. And we didn't have a lot of back and forth initially. But then, of course, we're both on the same mission. So we started going back and forth over emails and then talking on the phone. And we just met for the first time like a couple of weeks ago. So, yeah, yeah, which was so
Oh,
much fun. Yeah, so so I don't know. I don't know how much we've influenced each other in terms of writing and what to include and what not to, but I'm sure that we have. I'm just not exactly sure where that where those things start to cross over. But it was very interesting for me to learn about New York, um, and learn how it was the same and how it was different. And because as you know, and I write about in the book, my experiences with Sharon Gans were like, oh my God, who is this crazy lady? Like, why? Who is she? Because she would show up, every once in a while and teach a class, and everyone would be kissing her ass, and I didn't know who she was. Like, no one introduced her, So to learn how over the top she was, how mean she was, how abusive she was. It wasn't that way in Boston. It was way more insidious and underhanded.
for anybody listening that is thinking about writing their story or putting their journaling into a book or releasing their poetry or any of those things that a writer might contemplate in today's world of publication,
Mhm.
how did you make the decision to publish your book and what steps did you have to take to accomplish that?
Um, well, I had some encouragement. Sorry, I'm dealing with a cough drop right now, but so people who had read the blog had at times said to me, "You should turn this into a book," and I was like, "Yeah, that'd be great," but I have no idea what that process is. I don't know publishing it. I felt so clueless about it. But then I have a friend named Deirdre whose family is in publishing. They're in poetry and children's books, I believe. So it wasn't, she couldn't sign me or anything like that. But I had lunch with her one day. I mean, she specifically sat me down and said, "You really have a book here." Um, so I said, "All right, I'm going to give this a shot," Yeah. So that was helpful. And I have to say also that for me, writing has always been, I don't know, a thing that comes really naturally. Even as a kid, I was journaling, I was writing short stories. So um, at that point, it's a little foggy, honestly, but I can remember like over time coming up with this concept of not only do I want to write my story, I want to talk about the research. I want to talk about other people's experiences compared to mine. And, I do think in the memoir world, what does lack is information about recovery and how you can reclaim your life, And here are some tools, I don't see a whole lot of that. So I felt like that was a really important part of my book, like guess what? Not only can you feel better, you can thrive, which, is becoming quite an overused word, but it's the only one that I can think of that's accurate enough. You can thrive if you learn how this happened, why it happened, and how you can take this learning forward, Um, so the formatting started to kind of emerge from inside. And then I have to give credit to my friend Jamie Swally, who I met at she's on the book cover because I met her at a conference in Santa Fe, an International Cultic Studies conference, and this was in 2019. So 2020, COVID hits, we're all in lockdown. Um, she lives in Nevada. I live in Massachusetts. She used to Zoom with me in the morning, which is quite early on her end, because I would get kind of lost, in the formatting and trying to organize the content. It was really, really difficult. And Jamie, for absolutely no money, in fact, I actually insisted on paying her later because she was like a default editor, and she spent hours with me on Zoom at like she was like 3 in the morning in Nevada, and she's on Zoom
Oh,
with me,
wow.
um, helping me organize the content. So she was just integral to the process. And then I've had a lot of support from Debbie Shriver, who is right now the president of ICSA. And she talked to me a lot about how to go about publishing. And, finally it was like I could look for a publisher or I could just self publish on Amazon. Because, frankly, I've had people telling me how to say this and what to do for too long. And I don't really need that kind of guidance and I don't want to seek it out. And, I want to have the agency and independence that I get from self publishing. And, I had a few like not so wonderful experiences with these self publishing companies that charge money. That we won't fall down that rabbit hole because it could be like a whole other show. But, it's like a lot of people want to publish a book and it's speaking of con jobs, it's a good way to get people to pay you money, to promise them that you'll help them write and publish their book and then market it for them and then not, so in terms of people wanting to write their own story, the nice thing is that it's so possible now to publish. And it's, I think, an incredibly healing thing to do. I encourage people to do it. We actually need as many stories as possible to demonstrate. Don't do this.
Yeah. Yeah. The variety, but the same as well.
Yeah, yeah,
That books offer, again, that template almost.
yeah.
But each person's story comes with a variation on that template, whether it's the name of the group that you're a part of, or whether it's like, oh, this is our mantra instead of, this is our chant, or, all of those things. It's so important because then we can recognize it universally. Oh my goodness, I've heard someone use that word before in another group. Not
Mm,
this one. What's happening here? So I completely agree. And the more the more stories that we can get out there about different groups, the more we're putting out into the universe itself, so that if anybody's like, oh, I'm thinking about joining Dharn Yoga, Google's Dharn Yoga, someone's written their memoir about how you should never join Dharn Yoga, and then somebody's like, I'm not going to join Dharn Yoga. And wouldn't that just be the most incredible thing?
Hmm.
Imagine
Yeah,
getting approached in Whole Foods and you're like, oh gosh, something's not right about this. So I won't take your number, but thanks for the lovely chat.
yeah. Yep, enjoyed meeting you and your family, but maybe we don't need to become friends, you know?
Yeah. And here we are, we're back in hypotheticals again, but that was me. So I do apologize for that. Just
But that I think is a really natural place to go, do my friend I may have told you this in the last whenever we spoke last, but my friend Doug asked me once, like, would you go back and change it? And I write about this in the book, would you go back and change your experience? And I was like, you know, maybe, but in a way, it pushed me into a corner and I had to come out swinging, and I learned a lot from that. 5 years is way too long, though. If I could change it, maybe let's reduce it. Let's shrink it down to like 5 months.
it's strange to think about what 5 months would have looked like. Again, I'm just kind of thinking about the hypothetical
Hmm.
because 5 months wouldn't have been long enough for you to be deployable. I
Right,
say in air quotes.
right.
5 months is it's you're not funneled in enough at that point to be trusted to go out and air quotes make new friends.
Yeah, that's a really
Um
good point because that really was the thing that pushed me over the edge. It's like, I don't want to do this. I don't even believe in it. I am violating my own principles by going out and making new quote unquote friends. You know, I hated it. So I
oh,
sucked at
I
it.
yeah, I don't I feel like they call it secondhand cringe or secondhand embarrassment when somebody knocks on your door to sell you something. And I just think, oh gosh, I would feel so uncomfortable if that was me,
Yeah.
even if it's people knocking on the door to ask who my current energy supplier is, if they can get me I know it's still selling you something, but it's not like, it's not
Yeah, at least there's some use and value for you in it. But can
like,
I tell you, after I left
oh,
one day, Jehovah's Witnesses came to the door, and Casey, I was like, let me make you some tea. You know, I was like, I used to do stuff like this. um, and then they tried to give me their pamphlets, and I was like, I'm not gonna read these. Wouldn't you rather be doing something else right now? Like, I
and
mean,
I'm sure that most of them were, deep down the answer is yes.
they haven't been back, so.
That is the end of part 2 of this mini-series on the Odyssey study group Revisited. To find out more about Esther and her work, you can follow the links in the episode description. And to get in touch with me, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast.